somewhere along the northern edge of the Roman Empire, in a winter camp near a river the Romans called the Danube. A man in his 50s sits alone in a tent lined with maps and unread dispatches. Outside, the frontier is quiet in the way a frontier is never truly quiet. The low talk of soldiers, the shift of horses, the occasional cough that carries further than it should in cold air. He has been awake since before the fires were lit. He is not writing a letter. No courier waits outside to carry these words to Rome. He is not drafting a law or a decree or a speech for the Senate. He picks up a stylus, and by lamplight in Greek, not Latin, the language of law and command, but Greek, the language of philosophy, the language he had loved since he was a boy, he writes a short note to no one but himself. Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful, the envious, the unsocial. He does not sign it. He does not date it. He does not, as far as we can tell, ever intend for another human being to read it. And yet nearly 2,000 years later, we are still reading it, translated into every major language on earth, printed in the pockets of soldiers, prisoners, presidents, and ordinary people trying to get through an ordinary Tuesday. This is strange when you sit with it. The most powerful man in the known world, commander of legions, ruler of some 70 million people, a man who could have anything transcribed onto marble and displayed for eternity, chose instead to write privately, for an audience of one, in a genre so undefined that when later scribes finally gave the collection a name, the best they could manage was Ta Eyes Houghton. Things to himself, notes to himself, not a philosophy, not a memoir, not even strictly a diary, since a diary records what happened. This records what he was trying to become. We call him Marcus Aurelius. He ruled Rome from 161 to 180 AD, during what the historian Edward Gibbon would later describe as one of the happiest and most prosperous periods in human history. And yet Marcus himself spent nearly the entirety of his reign at war, watching plague empty the cities behind him, burying children faster than most fathers bury parents. The piece Gibbon saw from a library in 18th century England looked, from inside Marcus's tent on the Danube, like something closer to a slow-motion catastrophe that never quite stopped. What did a man do with that? Not a saint. Not a mystic withdrawn from the world into a cave or a monastery. A working head of state, with real armies and real deadlines and real grief, who had to get up every morning and rule an empire whether or not he felt like it. He wrote to himself, not to escape the work but to prepare for it. Each night, or in the gaps between one crisis and the next, he returned to the same handful of ideas, turning them over the way a man might turn a stone in his palm, checking it from every angle, wearing it smooth through repetition. What is actually within my control? What happens to a person after they die, and does that change how I should live now? Why does it matter what strangers think of me? How do I stay patient with people who are, by any reasonable measure, exhausting? These are not new questions. Marcus did not invent them. He was, by his own account, a mediocre philosopher standing on the shoulders of better ones, men like Zeno of Citium, who founded the school called Stoicism some 400 years before Marcus was born, and Epictetus, a former slave whose lectures on freedom and self-mastery Marcus read and reread until certain phrases became reflexes rather than ideas. What Marcus contributed was not originality. It was proof of use. Here is what these ideas look like, he shows us without ever meaning to, when applied by a man under the worst conditions his era could produce. Over the next several hours, we are going to walk through that notebook, not as a list of quotations to admire, but as the record of a mind working in real time, under real pressure, trying to answer the oldest question there is. How does a person live well, given that they are going to suffer, and given that they are going to die? We begin, as Marcus's own story begins, not on the throne, but in a garden in Rome, decades before the Purple Robe, when a boy who loved wrestling and philosophy more than politics was quietly being watched by an emperor who had already decided, long before the boy knew it, what his life was going to become. To understand the notebook, you first have to understand what it cost to become the person who wrote it. Marcus Aurelius was born Marcus Annius Verus in April of the year 121, into a wealthy and well-connected Roman family, not the imperial family, but close enough to it that the distance would eventually collapse. His father died when Marcus was still a small child, and he was raised largely by his mother, Domitia Lucilla, and by his grandfather in a household that could afford the finest tutors Rome had to offer. He tells us in the opening pages of his notebook, in a chapter almost no reader remembers because it looks at first glance like a dull list of thank yous. exactly who those tutors were and what each one gave him. From one, he says he learned not to side with either chariot-racing faction with excessive passion. From another, endurance of labor and wanting little. From his mother, he says he learned piety, generosity, and the habit of restraining not only evil deeds but even evil thoughts. It reads like a ledger. It is, in fact, one of the most quietly radical opening chapters in the history of philosophical writing, and we will return to why later. For now, what matters is this. Marcus grew up in a household that treated character formation as seriously as most households today treat school grades. He was, by every account that survives, a serious child. Serious enough that the Emperor Hadrian, ruling Rome at the time, aging, and without a son of his own, noticed him. Hadrian is said to have nicknamed the boy Verisimus, a pun on his family name Verus, meaning something like the truest one or most truthful. Whether the nickname was affectionate teasing or genuine assessment of character, we cannot know for certain. The sources here, as with much of Roman biography, mix reliable record with flattering legend, and a careful historian holds the anecdote loosely. But the pattern that follows is documented well enough. Hadrian, needing to secure a succession that would outlast his own uncertain health, arranged an unusual chain of adoptions. He adopted a senator named Antoninus on the condition, and this is the detail that changes everything, that Antoninus in turn adopt 2 boys as his own heirs, a younger child named Lucius and Marcus. Marcus was 17 when this happened, in the year 138. Overnight, a boy who had been reading philosophy and wrestling with friends on the Caelian Hill became the presumed future ruler of the largest empire the Western world had ever organized under a single authority. Consider for a moment what this actually meant for a 17-year-old mind. This was not an election. It was not even really a choice extended to him. It was closer to a sentence, handed down by men far more powerful than he was, based on political calculations he had no part in making. Later in the Meditations, Marcus writes with something close to relief about a man who managed to avoid becoming emperor. And there are lines throughout the notebook, subtle, easy to miss if you're not looking for them, that suggest a person who never fully reconciled himself to the role he'd been given. He did not campaign for power. Power was arranged around him while he was still young enough that no one thought to ask whether he wanted it. There is a useful comparison here, and it's one worth sitting with, because it explains something about why Marcus's philosophy sounds the way it does. Compare him to a figure like Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great, men who pursued power with open hunger, who wanted to be remembered, who built their identities around conquest and glory. Marcus's psychological starting point was the reverse. He inherited the position without desiring it, and much of his adult intellectual life reads like an ongoing effort to make peace with obligations he did not choose. This is not a minor biographical detail. It is, arguably, the single most important fact for understanding the Meditations, because a book written by a man chasing power looks completely different from a book written by a man trying to bear it honestly. His adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, became emperor the following year, in 161. No, we should be precise here. Antoninus became emperor in 138, upon Hadrian's death, and would rule for over 2 decades until 161. And it is in the character of Antoninus that we find the second great formative force in Marcus's life, one that Marcus documents with more affection and more specificity than he gives almost anyone else in the notebook. In the long passage he devotes to his adoptive father. Again, in that opening chapter of thank yous, Marcus describes a man who worked steadily rather than performing effort for an audience, a man who listened to advisors without being pushed around by flatterers, a man who treated the imperial office as work to be done well rather than a stage to be enjoyed. He notes, almost with wonder, that Antoninus was the same person in private as he was in public. No theatrics behind closed doors, no different face for the crowd than for the household staff. For a young man watching closely, being trained not through lectures, but through 2 decades of daily proximity to how a good ruler actually behaves under no cameras and no applause. This was an education more durable than anything a tutor could have taught in a classroom. By the time Marcus himself took the throne in 161, at the age of 39, he had spent more than 20 years as an apprentice emperor, present at councils, trained in law, immersed in the daily texture of governance, watching a genuinely decent man exercise enormous power without being corrupted by it. It is easy, looking back from 2,000 years later, to imagine Marcus's philosophical temperament as something innate, a personality he was simply born with. The record suggests something more interesting and more useful. It was built, deliberately, patiently over 2 decades, by a household and a mentor who treated the formation of character as the actual curriculum, and everything else, rhetoric, law, military theory, as secondary to it. But before we reach the throne, there is one more figure to meet, the teacher who, more than any other single person, gave Marcus the specific philosophical language he would use for the rest of his life. Not a general education in virtue, but a precise, technical, and at times brutally clarifying set of ideas drawn from a former slave who had never owned anything, but had, by Marcus's own account, been more free than most emperors. If you read Marcus's list of teachers in the first chapter of the Meditations, one name receives a weight the others don't quite match. Junius Rusticus, a Roman senator and philosopher considerably older than Marcus, whom Marcus credits with something very specific, not general wisdom, but a particular gift. Rusticus, he writes, was the one who showed him that his own character needed correction and cultivation, and who introduced him to the lecture notes of Epictetus, lending Marcus his personal copy. This detail is easy to read past, but it is worth pausing on, because it tells us something about how philosophy actually spread and functioned in the ancient world, and about who Epictetus was. Epictetus was born a slave, probably around the year 50 AD, in the Roman province of Phrygia, in what is now central Turkey. He belonged, for a portion of his life, to a man named Epaphroditus, himself a former slave who had risen to be a secretary to the Emperor Nero. A detail that gives you some sense of how tangled and unglamorous the actual social world of ancient Rome was, nothing like the marble simplicity we picture from statues. Epictetus was, by tradition, lamed, some accounts say by his master's cruelty, though the details are contested, and we should be honest that we don't have firm confirmation of the story's exact circumstances. What we do know with more confidence is that at some point he gained his freedom, studied philosophy, and eventually established his own school, first in Rome and then, after the Emperor Domitian expelled philosophers from the city around 93 AD, in the Greek town of Nicopolis on the western coast of Greece. Epictetus himself wrote nothing down. Everything we have from him, the discourses and the shorter Enchiridion, or handbook, comes from the notes of a student named Arrian, who apparently followed his lectures closely enough to transcribe them nearly verbatim. So by the time young Marcus, decades later and hundreds of miles away in Rome, sat down with Rusticus's borrowed copy, he was reading a transcript of a transcript, the recorded voice of a man born enslaved, teaching students who were often free citizens far above his old legal station about what freedom actually meant. And what Epictetus taught was, at its core, disarmingly simple to state and immensely difficult to practice. He divided everything in existence into 2 categories, things that are up to us and things that are not. Our judgments, our impulses, our desires and aversions, these are up to us, entirely within our power, and nothing external can ever take them away without our consent. Our body, our property, our reputation, our position, these are not up to us. They can be taken by illness, by theft, by the whims of other people, by simple accident, no matter how carefully we guard them. Epictetus's argument, and it is worth stating plainly, because it is the argument Marcus would spend the rest of his life trying to live inside, is that all human misery comes from confusing these 2 categories. We suffer not because bad things happen, but because we treat things that are not up to us as though they were, and then feel betrayed and wounded when the world, entirely predictably, fails to cooperate with our demands. Picture the strangeness of this scene for a moment. A young man born into one of the wealthiest, most protected families in the Roman world. A boy who by legal decree was going to inherit control over armies, treasuries, and the fates of tens of millions of people, sitting down to absorb the teachings of a man who had once been legally classified as property, and who insisted that none of that inherited power, none of it, actually mattered to the question of whether a person lived well. Not because wealth and power are evil. Epictetus did not preach poverty as a virtue in itself, but because wealth and power are, in his framework, simply not up to us in the way that matters. They can be given and taken by fortune, by politics, by disease. While the only thing that is fully and permanently ours is the quality of our own judgment, our own character, our own use of whatever circumstances we happen to find ourselves in. This is the idea Marcus would carry with him onto the throne, and it is the idea that gives the meditations its peculiar tone. A tone almost entirely absent from other imperial writing that survives from antiquity. Where other rulers left behind monuments boasting of conquest, Marcus left behind a private notebook obsessively concerned with getting his own reactions right. Not how do I defeat the Marcomanni, though he certainly had to think about that too, but how do I remain the kind of person who is not corrupted by defeating or failing to defeat the Marcomanni? There is a psychological function to this distinction that modern readers, 2,000 years removed from Stoic Rome, sometimes miss, because the language sounds antique even when the underlying mechanism is exactly what a contemporary psychologist would recognize. What Epictetus described, and what Marcus practiced daily, bears a close resemblance to what cognitive behavioral therapists in the 20th century would independently rediscover and formalize. The idea that our emotional suffering is generated not by events themselves, but by the judgments we layer on top of them, and that we can, with deliberate practice, examine and revise those judgments. Albert Ellis, one of the founders of modern cognitive therapy, said directly that he drew on Epictetus in developing his approach. This is not a coincidence worth glossing over. It means the notebook we are walking through tonight is not simply a historical artifact. It is an early field manual for a set of techniques that clinical psychology would spend 2,000 years rediscovering through different vocabulary. But in the year 161, none of this had yet been tested by anything close to its true weight. Marcus had studied the theory. He had not yet lived the practice. That test arrived almost the moment Antoninus Pius died. In fact, faster and harder than any emperor before him might reasonably have expected. And it arrived in a form no philosophy lecture could have fully prepared him for. Flood, war, and plague, nearly all at once. Within the first years of a reign he had never particularly wanted. Antoninus Pius died in the spring of 161, quietly and without drama, the way he seems to have done most things. On his last night, when asked by a tribune for the watchword, the password soldiers used to confirm the emperor's orders, the dying man is said to have answered with a single word: equanimitas, equanimity. It is possibly the most fitting last word any Roman emperor ever gave, and if the anecdote is even partly embellished by later historians eager for a tidy ending, it is at least embellished in the right direction, because it names the exact quality his adopted son had spent 2 decades absorbing from him. Marcus became emperor that same year at 39 years old, notably late for a Roman succession, and notably reluctant. He immediately did something unusual. He insisted that the Senate grant equal power to his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, making Rome, for the first time in its history, governed by 2 emperors jointly rather than one. Historians still debate his motive. Some read it as shrewd politics, a way of sharing the burden and the risk. Others read it more simply as consistent with everything else we know about the man. A person handed total authority who immediately tried to distribute some of it elsewhere, because total authority concentrated in one person was never something he seems to have wanted for its own sake. He did not get a honeymoon. Within months of taking the throne, the river Tiber flooded catastrophically, destroying grain stores and drowning livestock across the city, triggering famine in a Rome that depended on those stores to feed a population in the hundreds of thousands. Almost simultaneously, the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival to the east, in what is now Iraq and Iran, invaded Roman territory in Armenia and Syria, inflicting a serious defeat on a Roman legion and threatening the empire's eastern frontier. Lucius Verus was dispatched to handle the Parthian War, while Marcus remained in Rome managing the administrative machinery of an empire, now fighting on multiple fronts before its new emperor had been in office a full year. The Eastern War was eventually won. Roman forces under capable generals pushed back the Parthians and even sacked their capital. But the returning legions carried something back with them that would prove far more destructive than any army they had faced abroad. A disease, likely smallpox or something closely related to it, that historians now call the Antonine Plague, in Marcus's honor, though honor is an uncomfortable word for what followed. It spread along the trade and military routes back into the heart of the empire, into Rome itself, and then outward across the provinces, killing. By the estimates historians consider most credible, though ancient population figures are notoriously difficult to pin down precisely, somewhere between 5 and 10 million people over the following 2 decades. Some estimates for individual bad years suggest that thousands died daily in Rome alone at the outbreak's peak. Try, for a moment, to hold the scale of that honestly, without letting the number go numb the way large historical numbers tend to. This was not a war Marcus could win with better generals or a smarter campaign. It was an invisible, indiscriminate killer that moved through his cities faster than any legion, that did not care about rank or virtue or philosophical training, that took farmers and senators and soldiers, and eventually, several of Marcus's own children. He and his wife, Faustina, had at least 13 children over the course of their marriage. Only a handful survived to adulthood. This is worth sitting within its own right. Apart from the plague specifically, infant and childhood mortality in the ancient world was brutal even in the best of times, even in the wealthiest households, even with the finest physicians money could buy. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man alive, could not protect his own children from death any better than the poorest farmer along the Danube could protect his. And even as Rome's cities emptied from disease, the frontier itself began to buckle. Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and others, pressured by their own migrations and by opportunistic timing against a weakened Rome, began pushing across the Danube in the mid-160s, in what would become known as the Marcomannic Wars. These were not brief border skirmishes. They were a sustained, grinding, nearly two-decade conflict that would consume most of the remainder of Marcus's reign and eventually require him to leave Rome and command from the field personally, something emperors of his temperament. A man who by every account preferred a library to a battlefield, did not do lightly or willingly. It is genuinely difficult to construct, from the whole of Roman history, a worse opening decade for a new emperor who had not asked for the job in the first place. Flood, Eastern War, a plague that would eventually claim a meaningful percentage of the empire's total population. A collapsing northern frontier that would keep him away from home, commanding troops in unfamiliar, cold, and increasingly desperate terrain, for years at a stretch. This is the context that matters enormously, and is so easy to lose when the Meditations gets excerpted into short, tidy quotations for calendars and social media captions. Marcus did not write, "You have power over your mind," not outside events, from a comfortable study with the leisure to philosophize about hypothetical hardship. He wrote sentences very much like it from inside a military tent, during a war he had not chosen, in a reign inaugurated by catastrophe, having already buried children he had not been able to save, surrounded by an empire being physically depopulated by a disease no one of his era understood well enough to stop. The philosophy was not decoration. It was the load-bearing structure that kept the man functioning at all. Given everything Marcus was managing during these years, war on two fronts at different points in his reign, plague, administration, grief, it raises an obvious question worth pausing on directly. Why did he write the Meditations at all? What was the notebook actually for? The honest answer is that we don't know with certainty, because Marcus never tells us explicitly, and no contemporary source describes him discussing the project with anyone. What we can reconstruct comes from internal evidence in the text itself, and from what we know more broadly about Stoic practice in his era. The original Greek title given to the collection by later editors, likely centuries after Marcus's death, was Ta Eis Huten, the things directed toward himself, or more loosely, to himself. Marcus did not title it this. He probably did not title it anything, because he probably never conceived of it as a single unified work at all. What survives is generally understood by scholars to be a collection of 12 books, of widely varying length and polish, written at different times, in different places, likely over the final decade or so of his life. Much of it based on internal references to military camps and specific campaigns, composed during his years commanding on the northern frontier. The structure, or rather the deliberate absence of one, tells us something important. This is not an argued treatise, building a case chapter by chapter toward a conclusion, the way a formal philosophical work by Aristotle or Cicero might. It reads instead like exactly what it almost certainly was. A series of private notes, aphorisms, reminders, occasional longer reflections, written to reinforce ideas the author already believed but needed, urgently and repeatedly, to reconvince himself of. The same themes recur again and again throughout the 12 books: the shortness of life, the unimportance of posthumous fame, the discipline of accepting what cannot be changed, the duty to remain patient with difficult people. Not because Marcus had run out of new things to say, but because that repetition was the entire point. This was not a book meant to teach a reader something once. It was a tool meant to retrain its single author, continuously, against the pull of frustration, grief, anger, and despair that his actual daily life kept generating. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem to. There is a meaningful difference between philosophy written to persuade an audience and philosophy written to discipline oneself, and the Meditations sits unmistakably in the second category. Marcus was not building an argument for skeptical readers to be won over by. He already believed the Stoic framework he had learned from Rusticus and from his reading of Epictetus. What he needed, and what most of us need, if we are honest about how belief actually functions, was not new information, but the friction of repetition, applied against the daily erosion of practicing what he already knew to be true. Consider Book 1 again, briefly, because we skipped past its actual significance earlier. That long list of teachers and family members, and what Marcus says he learned from each of them, is not an act of vanity or record-keeping. Read carefully, it functions as a kind of self-administered gratitude exercise, and more than that, a deliberate act of remembering who had shaped him, at a moment, likely written, based on scholarly dating, well into his reign, possibly even toward its end, when many of those people were already dead, and when the daily grind of rule could easily have crowded out the memory of what he owed to them. It is, in effect, Marcus reminding himself where his own character came from, so that he does not mistake it for something he generated alone, in isolation, deserving no gratitude toward anyone. This turns out to be one of the notebook's quietest, but most important functions throughout. Marcus using the act of writing itself as a corrective against the specific psychological dangers of his exact position. Absolute power tends, historically and almost without exception, to corrode the character of the person who holds it. Flattery accumulates, consequences for bad behavior disappear, and the feedback that normally keeps ordinary people honest simply stops arriving, because who is going to tell an emperor he is wrong? Marcus seems to have understood this risk with unusual clarity, and the notebook reads, across its full length, like a man building his own feedback loop by hand, because the one that would normally exist for an ordinary citizen had been stripped away by his position. He reminds himself, over and over, not to become hardened by power, not to let the purple robe change what kind of person he is underneath it, not to expect praise, and not to be destabilized by its absence, not to let anger at difficult colleagues curdle into contempt for them. These are not abstract philosophical positions defended for their logical elegance. They are working repairs, applied nightly, to a man who understood exactly what his job was doing to him and refused to let it happen without a fight. It is worth naming plainly what this means for how we should read the book tonight, and for the chapters that follow. We are not examining a systematic philosophy laid out with the tidy architecture of a lecture course. We are examining a set of recurring exercises, really more like habits of mind than doctrines, that a specific, historically documented, deeply burdened man used to keep himself functional, and by his own standard, good, across 2 decades of a job he had never asked for. The ideas repeat because his need for them repeated. And the 2 ideas he returns to more than any others, the twin engines running underneath nearly every page of the notebook, are the same 2 we touched on through Epictetus. The question of what is actually within a person's control, and the question of how a person's death should change the way they treat the time they have left before it. We turn to the first of those now, on the frontier itself, where Marcus applied it under conditions that would test it far past the point of comfortable theory. Picture the actual physical conditions Marcus was writing in his final decade of life, because the setting changes how the ideas should land. He is no longer in Rome, with its libraries and its baths and its accustomed comforts. He is somewhere along the Danube frontier, likely near a camp such as Carnuntum or Sirmium, in territory that would today fall across parts of Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. Cold, wet, militarily precarious ground, defended by legions fighting an enemy that kept regenerating faster than Rome could permanently subdue it. He is in his 50s, in poor health by most accounts, managing supply lines and troop movements, and the political machinery of an empire he still had to run by courier from hundreds of miles away. While also personally present at a war he had never trained his whole life to fight, because his whole life had trained him instead to rule wisely, not to command armies. It is from inside this exact set of circumstances that Marcus returns, again and again, to the idea he first absorbed as a young man reading Epictetus. that the whole of human experience divides cleanly into what is up to us and what is not. The soldiers dying around him from wounds or disease were not up to him, in the sense that once the plague had entered the ranks or an enemy arrow had found its mark, no force of will on Marcus's part could reverse it. The tribes across the river, and whether they would attack this season or the next, were not up to him. The weather, the length of the war, the health of his own aging body, none of these were, in the Stoic sense, within his control. What remained his, entirely and inescapably his, was something narrower and at the same time far more demanding. His own judgments about these events, his own choices about how to respond to them, his own effort to act with justice and good sense, regardless of what the war itself was doing. This sounds, stated plainly like this, almost too simple to be useful. The kind of idea that gets printed on a poster and then ignored the first time something genuinely painful happens. But watch how Marcus actually deploys it, because the deployment is where the real teaching sits, not in the bare statement of the principle. In one of the notebook's recurring exercises, Marcus reminds himself that when someone wrongs him, a subordinate who fails a duty, an ally who proves unreliable, a soldier who behaves badly, the correct response is not to be surprised or outraged, because expecting people never to act badly is itself an error in judgment, a failure to understand what people actually are. He writes in a passage that has become one of the most quoted in the entire work, that he should begin each morning by reminding himself he will encounter the meddling, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the dishonest, the jealous, and the surly, not because the world is full of villains, but because these traits arise from a widespread ignorance of what is genuinely good and bad, an ignorance he himself has been fortunate enough to see passed through his own study and training. And crucially, he adds that none of these people can implicate him in anything shameful, because he cannot be harmed by another person's wrongdoing, unless he lets that wrongdoing corrupt his own judgment and his own conduct in response. This is the dichotomy of control doing real, load-bearing work, not decorative work. It is not telling Marcus to stop caring whether his soldiers behave well or whether his allies keep their word. It is telling him precisely where his emotional investment should be placed, not in the outcome, which he cannot fully govern, but in his own conduct and his own response to the outcome, which he can. A modern reader might recognize this immediately as an early ancestor of what performance psychologists today call focusing on process over outcome. The well-documented finding that people perform better and suffer less when they direct their attention toward the actions within their control, rather than the results that depend on factors beyond it. An archer who obsesses over whether the arrow will land in the target performs worse than one who focuses entirely on form, breath, and release, precisely because the flight of the arrow, once loosed, is no longer up to the archer at all. Marcus, without any of this modern vocabulary, was applying essentially the same insight to the vastly higher stakes arena of war, plague, and imperial administration. There is a useful thought experiment buried inside this idea, one Marcus himself gestures toward in several passages, and it is worth spelling out directly because it clarifies exactly what the dichotomy is and is not claiming. Imagine two men receiving the identical piece of devastating news, say, the loss of a battle or the failure of a harvest they depended on. The event itself, the bare fact of the loss, is identical for both, but one man immediately layers a judgment on top of the fact. This is a catastrophe, this should not have happened, I cannot bear this. The other man experiences the same loss but works, through trained habit, to separate the bare fact from the judgment. This has happened, it was not within my power to prevent it entirely, and now the only live question is what I do next. The event has not changed between the two men. What has changed is the internal act of interpretation layered onto it. And it is this interpretive layer, Stoicism insists, and modern cognitive psychology has since independently confirmed through decades of clinical research, that actually generates the suffering, far more than the raw event itself does. This is not, it should be said clearly, a doctrine of indifference or emotional flatness, and reading it that way is probably the single most common misunderstanding of Stoicism in the modern popular imagination. The caricature of the stiff-lipped, feelingless Stoic, suppressing everything, admitting nothing. Marcus's own notebook contradicts this caricature directly and repeatedly. He writes about grief. He writes about the genuine difficulty of remaining patient with irritating people. He does not pretend these feelings are absent from his experience. He documents the ongoing effort of managing them, which is a very different thing from claiming to have transcended them entirely. The dichotomy of control was never meant as an instruction to feel nothing. It was an instruction about where to direct one's effort, not toward controlling the uncontrollable, an effort that is guaranteed to fail and guaranteed to produce frustration, but toward the far harder and more productive work of governing one's own responses, which is difficult enough on its own to occupy an entire lifetime of practice, as Marcus's endlessly repetitive notebook itself demonstrates. It's worth noting, too, how this idea intersects with leadership specifically, since Marcus was not merely a private philosopher but a man responsible for the decisions of an empire. A ruler who cannot distinguish between what is and is not within his control is a ruler prone to two opposite and equally damaging failures. Either paralysis, from trying to control outcomes that depend on too many factors beyond his reach, or recklessness, from assuming that sheer force of will can override circumstance if applied hard enough. Marcus's notebook suggests a third path, harder than either clear-eyed effort applied fully to the decisions and conduct within his authority, paired with a settled acceptance of whatever the war, the plague, or the harvest ultimately does regardless of that effort. It is a demanding balance to strike. Nothing in the text suggests Marcus found it easy. What the text does suggest, through its sheer repetition across a decade of writing, is that he kept returning to try again, night after night, war after war, loss after loss. There is a specific mental exercise that recurs throughout the Meditations, one so distinctive that historians of philosophy have given it a name: the view from above. Marcus repeatedly invites himself to imagine looking down at human affairs from an immense height, from the vantage of the stars, or from some impossible position above the whole of the earth, and to observe from that distance how small and fleeting the concerns that consume him on the ground actually appear. He writes of picturing the entire inhabited world as a single point in the vastness of space, and Rome itself, the city he governs, as a mere corner of that point. He imagines the procession of human generations, the endless churn of birth, brief life, and death, repeated identically across every century of recorded history and every century before it, and observes how thoroughly interchangeable, from this height, one human drama is with another. The wars that consume his years on the Danube, the political rivalries of the Roman Senate, his own personal grief and frustration, all of it, viewed from sufficiently far away, resolves into the same small, repeating pattern that has played out countless times before and will play out countless times again, largely indifferent to which particular names attach to which particular instance of it. This might sound, on first encounter, like a bleak or even nihilistic exercise, a way of telling oneself that nothing matters. But that is a significant misreading of what Marcus is actually doing with it, and the distinction matters enough to draw out carefully. The view from above is not deployed in the notebook as a way of concluding that human effort is meaningless. It is deployed specifically as a corrective against two particular distortions of perspective that Marcus, in his position, was especially vulnerable to: excessive anxiety about setbacks that felt enormous only because he was standing too close to them, and excessive vanity about achievements and status that likewise felt enormous only from ground level. Zoom out far enough, and the emperor's robe looks like what it actually is: cloth, dyed with a particular expensive pigment, draped over an ordinary mortal body that will decay exactly as every other body decays. Zoom out far enough, and the crisis of the moment, whichever crisis happened to be consuming him that week, takes its place in a long procession of crises that other rulers faced, survived or didn't, and were in turn forgotten by history almost entirely. There is a strikingly direct line from this 2,000-year-old exercise to a much more recent one. In 1990, the American astronomer Carl Sagan persuaded NASA to turn the Voyager 1 spacecraft around, from a distance of roughly 4 billion miles, to photograph Earth one last time before the probe left the solar system for good. The resulting image showed the planet as a single faint speck of light, less than a pixel across, suspended in a beam of scattered sunlight. What Sagan would later call, in a passage now famous in its own right, the pale blue dot. Sagan's reflection on that photograph: that every human life, every war, every triumph and tragedy in the whole of recorded history had occurred on that single mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam, is, in substance if not in scientific vocabulary, almost exactly the exercise Marcus was performing in his tent on the Danube 18 centuries earlier, without a telescope, using nothing but disciplined imagination. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it says something important about the durability of the underlying insight. Marcus did not have access to astronomy remotely resembling what Sagan had. He could not have known the actual physical scale of the universe, could not have calculated the genuine, staggering insignificance of Earth within it, the way modern instruments allow us to. And yet he reached, through pure philosophical reasoning and disciplined imaginative exercise, toward a psychological function nearly identical to the one a 20th century photograph would later provide for millions of people who saw it. A jolt of scale, deliberately administered, to shrink the disproportionate size that immediate personal concerns tend to take on when we are standing too close to them. There is a practical mechanism worth naming here, because it explains why the exercise actually works rather than simply sounding poetic. Human beings are, by the basic architecture of perception, terrible judges of scale when we are embedded inside a situation. A deadline that feels civilization ending on a Tuesday afternoon rarely retains that wait a year later, and almost never retains it a decade later. Not because the deadline didn't matter, but because our in-the-moment assessment of its importance was distorted by proximity, the same way a coin held an inch from the eye can block out the entire sun. Marcus's view from above exercise is, in effect, a deliberate technique for correcting this proximity distortion on demand, without needing to actually wait the year or the decade for perspective to arrive naturally. He zooms out on command, using imagination as the lens, precisely because he does not have the luxury of waiting for time to do the zooming for him. He has a war to conduct this afternoon, and he needs the psychological steadiness now, not after the crisis has safely receded into memory. It is also worth noting what the exercise is not asking Marcus, or us, to conclude. It is not asking him to stop caring about the war, to abandon his post, to treat the plague deaths around him as meaningless because they are cosmically small. The Stoics were never advocates of withdrawal from duty, quite the opposite, as we'll see clearly in a later chapter on Marcus's relentless insistence on doing one's assigned work regardless of mood or motivation. What the exercise changes is not whether Marcus acts, but the emotional posture from which he acts, engaged fully with the task in front of him, while holding his own personal stake in its outcome, his reputation, his comfort, his fear of failure lightly enough that it does not distort his judgment or paralyze him with anxiety. He fights the war. He administers the empire. He grieves his children. But he does all of it, or at least strives to do all of it, from a vantage that refuses to mistake the size of his own feelings for the size of the actual event. This zoomed-out view sets up directly the subject of the next chapter, because there is one particular fact that the view from above brings into unavoidable focus more than any other. The fact that every single person Marcus commands, fears, loves, or grieves, including Marcus himself, is going to die, probably sooner than any of them expect. And that this fact, rather than being something to avoid thinking about, was for Marcus one of the single most clarifying tools available to a person trying to live well. Death was not an abstraction to Marcus Aurelius. It is worth stating this plainly before examining what he wrote about it, because the modern phrase Memento Mori, remember you must die, has drifted, in its contemporary popular usage, toward something decorative. A skull printed on a journal cover, a tasteful reminder to seize the day. For Marcus, writing where and when he wrote, death was not a design motif. It was the daily operating condition of his entire adult life. By the time he was composing the bulk of the Meditations, likely across the 170s, Marcus had already lost multiple children. Historians differ on the exact count given the incompleteness of the record, but the consensus is that of at least 13 children born to him and his wife Faustina. Only a handful survived into adulthood, several dying in infancy or early childhood. In some cases, during the very years, the plague was moving through Roman territory. He had watched a disease with no name and no known cure move through his legions, his capital, and his household with total indifference to rank. He was, during the composition of much of the notebook, physically present on a military frontier where death by violence, exposure, or illness was not a hypothetical concern, but the ordinary background condition of every single day. Given this, it is worth reading his passages on death not as philosophical speculation performed at a comfortable remove, but as a working man's attempt to think clearly about the one fact he could not avoid, could not delay, and could not solve through better administration or a stronger legion. His basic argument, repeated across dozens of passages in slightly different forms, runs roughly as follows. Death is not, in itself, an evil, a claim that requires some unpacking, because it runs directly against the instinctive human recoil from mortality, and Marcus knew it would strike many readers as counterintuitive or even callous. His reasoning draws on a broader Stoic physics, one that held the universe together as a single continuous, rational, ever-changing whole, in which every individual thing, a person, a tree, an empire, is a temporary configuration of the same underlying material, destined eventually to dissolve back into that larger whole and be reconfigured into something else. Death, on this view, is not an ending imposed from outside nature as a cruel interruption. It is simply nature's ordinary operating process, the same process by which a seed becomes a plant, and a plant eventually returns to soil. To be horrified by death in this framework is to be horrified by something as basic and unavoidable as the changing of seasons. An understandable emotional reaction, perhaps, but not a rational or useful one. More practically, and this is where the idea does its real work for Marcus, rather than remaining a piece of abstract cosmology. He uses the certainty of death as a tool for clarifying what actually matters in the time before it arrives. If a person genuinely internalizes that their life could end this year, this month, possibly this very day, several distortions common to ordinary living tend to fall away rather quickly. The temptation to postpone acting well until some more convenient future moment loses its logic, because there is no guarantee that future moment will ever arrive. The obsession with how one will be remembered after death loses much of its force too, because Marcus repeatedly points out how quickly even the most celebrated historical figures are forgotten, misremembered, or reduced to a name attached to almost nothing specific. He names, in one passage, several once famous men whose achievements have already been swallowed by time, as a way of demonstrating just how thin and unreliable posthumous glory actually is as a thing to organize a life around. There is a specific meditation, among the most quietly devastating passages in the whole notebook, in which Marcus reflects on the deaths of philosophers and physicians, men whose entire professions were built around understanding the human condition or preserving human life, and observes that all their expertise, all their wisdom about mortality or their skill at postponing it in others, did nothing whatsoever to exempt them from dying exactly like everyone else. The physician who has treated countless dying patients eventually dies himself. The philosopher who has written volumes about the nature of death eventually experiences it exactly like the illiterate farmer who never once considered the question. Knowledge about death, Marcus is pointing out with a certain bracing honesty, buys no special immunity from it. What it can buy, and this is the entire pivot the passage turns on, is a better way of living during the time available before it arrives, which is the only thing within a person's control regarding death in the first place, since the timing and manner of it almost never are. This connects directly back to the dichotomy of control from the previous chapter, and it's worth making the connection explicit, because Marcus himself treats these ideas as inseparable rather than as a list of unrelated topics. Whether he dies this year on the Danube, of plague or in battle or of ordinary illness, is not up to him. What is up to him is whether the years, months, or days remaining are spent well, administered honestly, endured with patience, met without excessive complaint or self-pity. Memento Mori, in Marcus's actual usage of it, is not a morbid dwelling on death for its own sake. It is a disciplined technique for stripping away everything trivial and inessential from the way a person spends the time they do have, by holding constantly in view the fact that this time is neither unlimited nor guaranteed to continue past the present moment. There is a passage, brief, almost throwaway in tone, and for that reason one of the more quietly powerful ones in the whole collection, in which Marcus reminds himself that a person can lose only the present moment, since that is the only thing anyone actually possesses at any given time. The past is already gone beyond anyone's power to alter, and the future has not yet arrived and may never arrive at all. Whether a life lasts 80 years or 8, the argument runs, the only thing that death actually takes from a person is this current instant, because this current instant is the only portion of time a living person genuinely holds. It is a strange, almost mathematical way of neutralizing the fear of a long life cut short. And whether or not it fully succeeds as consolation, reasonable readers can and do disagree about whether the argument is airtight or merely a clever piece of reframing. It demonstrates the underlying method with total clarity. Marcus using logical analysis, applied with real rigor, as an emotional tool, not merely an intellectual exercise performed for its own sake. We should be honest about something here, in the spirit of not flattening a complicated man into a simple wisdom-dispensing machine. The sheer frequency with which Marcus returns to this theme, page after page, across years of writing, suggests a man who needed to keep re-arguing himself into this acceptance, rather than a man who had settled the question once and moved on with permanent equanimity. That repetition is not a flaw in the philosophy. It may be the most honest and most useful thing about the entire notebook. Marcus does not present himself as having achieved effortless peace with death. He presents himself as a man in an ongoing, nightly negotiation with his own fear and grief, using the same handful of arguments over and over, because the fear and grief kept returning and needed to be met again each time they did. If the dichotomy of control tells Marcus where to direct his effort, and Memento Mori tells him why that effort matters given how little time there is to apply it, there is a third idea running through the notebook that explains, more precisely than either of the other two, exactly how a person is supposed to do the actual daily work of staying steady. Marcus calls it, in various formulations scattered throughout the text, the discipline of perception, the practice of examining and correcting the judgments a person layers onto raw events, before those judgments have a chance to calcify into unexamined emotional reaction. The clearest statement of the underlying principle appears in one of the notebook's most frequently quoted lines, that a person is disturbed not by events themselves, but by their opinions about those events. This is, again, drawn almost directly from Epictetus, who states an extremely similar formulation in the opening lines of the Enchiridion. But Marcus does something with the idea that Epictetus's surviving lecture notes do not quite do in the same way. He shows the reader, across dozens of specific applications, what this looks like in the actual granular texture of an emperor's daily frustrations, rather than leaving it as a general principle to be applied however the reader sees fit. Take, as one clear example, his treatment of insults and criticism from other people. Marcus reasons through the situation with something close to a formal argument. If someone insults him, the insult itself, mere sounds, or marks on a page, has no power to harm him directly in the way a physical blow might. What can harm him is only his own judgment that the insult is something worth being wounded by. Strip away that judgment, he argues, and what remains is simply noise, no more capable of disturbing his character than the wind. This is not, it's worth repeating from the earlier chapter, a claim that insults never sting or that Marcus felt nothing when criticized. The notebook's own repeated returns to this theme suggest exactly the opposite, that he felt the sting regularly and had to keep working, actively and deliberately, to prevent that sting from curdling into resentment or retaliation. The discipline of perception is not a claim of natural immunity. It is a description of a skill, one that requires ongoing practice precisely because it does not come naturally. There's a specific mental technique Marcus recommends, and it is genuinely useful to isolate as a standalone practice, because it maps with remarkable precision onto a core technique used in modern cognitive behavioral therapy nearly 2 millennia later. When something happens that provokes a strong reaction, anger, fear, grief, humiliation, Marcus advises pausing to describe the event in the most stripped-down, purely factual terms possible, before any interpretive layer has been added. Not this man has deliberately wronged and humiliated me, but rather something closer to. This man performed a particular action, using his body, guided by his mind, based on his own understanding of what was good for him, an understanding that happens to be mistaken. The technique works by deliberately separating the bare, neutral description of what physically occurred from the evaluative story. A person's mind almost automatically wraps around it. Once separated, the bare event is frequently revealed to be far less catastrophic than the story built on top of it. And the evaluative story itself, the part actually generating the emotional pain, becomes visible as a choice, or at least as something closer to a habit, rather than an unavoidable automatic fact about reality. Modern clinical psychologists call something very close to this cognitive distancing, or decentering. The practice of stepping back from a thought or a reaction enough to observe it as a mental event, rather than as an unquestionable statement of fact about the world. Aaron Beck, the psychiatrist generally credited as the founder of cognitive therapy, developed techniques in the mid-20th century that bear a striking structural resemblance to what Marcus was doing by lamplight on the Danube, identifying automatic, often distorted interpretations of events, and training patients to notice and question those interpretations, rather than accepting them uncritically as accurate readings of reality. Beck, like Ellis before him, acknowledged the debt to Stoic philosophy directly. This is, again, worth pausing on rather than treating as a passing curiosity. An ancient emperor's private coping notebook anticipated, in its practical technique if not its theoretical vocabulary, a set of therapeutic tools that would eventually be validated through controlled clinical research and become standard practice in the treatment of anxiety and depression across the modern world. Marcus applies this discipline to more than just insults and personal slights. He applies it to physical pain, reasoning in several passages that pain which is bearable can be borne, and pain which is genuinely unbearable will, by its nature, end quickly, either through death or through the pain subsiding. And that anticipatory dread about pain not yet occurring is itself an entirely separate and avoidable form of suffering, layered on top of whatever the physical sensation itself might eventually turn out to require enduring. He applies it to the ordinary friction of dealing with incompetent or difficult subordinates, reminding himself that expecting flawless behavior from imperfect people is itself the flawed judgment requiring correction, not their behavior. He applies it perhaps most demandingly to his own recurring reluctance to get out of bed and do the work in front of him. A passage we'll examine closely in an upcoming chapter, because it is one of the most human and least philosophically polished moments in the entire notebook, and for that reason, one of the most valuable. What unites all of these applications is the same underlying move, performed with slightly different content each time. Catch the interpretive judgment before it hardens into an emotional reaction. Examine whether that judgment is actually accurate or merely habitual, and where possible, replace it with a more accurate and less self-damaging one. This is not, and Marcus never presents it as, a technique that produces instant or permanent mastery. The notebook's own relentless repetition of the exercise, page after page, across years of writing, is itself the clearest evidence available that even a man this disciplined, this well-trained, and this philosophically committed had to keep doing the work again and again, because the automatic, unexamined judgments kept reasserting themselves, the way an untrained habit always tries to reassert itself against a newer, harder one. It is this same discipline, turned outward rather than inward, that shapes how Marcus approached the single most demanding and least glamorous part of his entire philosophy, doing the actual work of ruling, day after day, whether or not he happened to feel like it, and whether or not anyone was there to notice or applaud when he did. There is a passage near the very beginning of Book 5 of the Meditations that stands apart from almost everything else in the notebook for its bluntness, and it is worth quoting in substance because it captures something the rest of the book approaches more obliquely. Marcus describes with unusual honesty the experience of waking before dawn and not wanting to get up. He imagines saying to himself, "I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain about if I'm going to do what I was born for, the very things I was brought into the world to do?" And he pushes the thought further, comparing himself unfavorably in that drowsy moment of reluctance to the plants, the birds, and the insects, all of which perform their proper function in the world without complaint, without needing to be persuaded, without hitting a reluctant snooze on their own existence. This passage matters enormously, and it is worth dwelling on precisely because of how unglamorous it is. This is not Marcus writing about grand cosmic acceptance of death, or the vast scale of the universe, or the philosophical dignity of enduring war. This is Marcus writing about the incredibly ordinary, almost embarrassingly relatable experience of not wanting to get out of bed and do his job. The most powerful man in the Western world, ruler of an empire spanning from Britain to the edge of Persia, apparently struggled with the exact same low-grade morning reluctance that affects an ordinary person facing an ordinary workday. And rather than hide this struggle behind a curated image of effortless imperial dignity, he wrote it down, honestly, as a problem requiring an actual argument to solve. The argument he constructs for himself is worth examining closely, because it reveals something central to his entire ethical framework. The idea that duty is not something a person does for external reward, praise, gratitude, recognition, or even the simple satisfaction of a job well received. But something a person does because acting according to one's nature and role is, in itself, the entire point, independent of any response it receives from the outside world. This connects to a broader Stoic idea about human purpose that runs throughout the notebook, drawing on the school's belief that everything in nature has a proper function it is suited to perform, that a vine is meant to bear grapes, a bee is meant to make honey, an eye is meant to see, and that human beings, uniquely among living things, are equipped with reason, and are therefore meant to use that reason in service of justice, cooperation, and the collective good of the human community they belong to. On this view, doing one's duty well is not a means to some further reward. It is the fulfillment of what a person actually is, in the same direct and unglamorous way that a functioning eye fulfills what an eye actually is by seeing. A person who does their duty only when applauded for it, and slacks when the applause is absent, has fundamentally misunderstood what duty is for in the first place, treating it as a performance for an audience rather than as the basic exercise of one's own rational nature. Marcus returns to this theme with what can only be described as genuine irritation at a particular category of person. Those who do good deeds and then need to be thanked, praised, or reminded of their own goodness, unable to simply move on to the next task the way, he says, a vine produces grapes without demanding recognition for having done so, or the way a horse runs without expecting applause for having run. There is a passage where he pushes this to what might be its most demanding conclusion, that a person who has done something good should not even need to be aware, in a self-congratulatory way, that they have done something good. They should simply move to the next useful action, the way a person moves from one number to the next in counting, without pausing to admire themselves for having correctly completed the previous one. This is a genuinely severe standard, and it is worth being honest about how difficult it is, rather than presenting it as an easy or obvious truth. Human beings are, by nature and by the basic architecture of social psychology, deeply responsive to recognition and praise. This is not a character flaw unique to lesser people that Marcus alone had transcended, but a near universal feature of how social animals are built, reinforced across evolutionary history, because the desire for social approval helped hold cooperative groups together. Marcus is not claiming to have eliminated this desire in himself. What the repeated returns to this theme across the notebook suggest, again, is a man actively working against a strong and recurring pull toward wanting recognition. A pull he clearly felt, precisely because he needed to keep arguing himself out of it, again and again, rather than having settled the matter once, permanently early in his reign. There is a leadership dimension to this that deserves specific attention, because it separates Marcus rather sharply from a great many other historical figures who held comparable power. A ruler who requires visible gratitude and public acclaim to sustain his own motivation is a ruler whose actual behavior becomes, whether he intends it or not, hostage to public opinion, prone to popular but poorly judged decisions when approval is scarce, and prone to complacency when approval is abundant. Marcus's insistence on acting well regardless of whether anyone notices was not merely a private psychological comfort. It was, functionally, a form of governance discipline, an attempt to insulate his actual decision-making from the distorting pressure of wanting to be liked or admired by the people he ruled. Whether he fully achieved this in practice, across 2 decades of real political pressure, is not something we can verify with certainty from the outside. But the sustained, repeated effort recorded in the notebook is itself a meaningful historical fact, distinct from the question of how perfectly he lived up to it. There is also a quieter, more personal dimension to this idea worth naming before we move on, because it connects duty back to the earlier chapters on death and control. If, as Marcus repeatedly reminds himself, fame and posthumous reputation are unreliable and largely outside a person's control, subject to the whims of later historians, the accidents of what records happen to survive, the shifting judgments of generations he will never meet, then building one's motivation for good conduct around the hope of being remembered well is building on precisely the kind of unstable, externally controlled foundation that Stoic philosophy warns against throughout. Acting well because it is one's proper function, independent of whether anyone notices now or remembers later, is the only version of the motivation that survives contact with the actual unpredictability of how history treats even its most consequential figures. It is worth noting, with a certain irony Marcus could not have anticipated, that the notebook which makes this argument so insistently write your duty, expect no credit, do not need to be remembered, is itself the primary reason he is remembered today, nearly 2,000 years later, far more vividly than almost any other Roman emperor, including several who spent considerably more effort chasing exactly the kind of glory he was arguing against. No theme in the Meditations receives more sustained, patient, almost obsessive attention than the difficulty of dealing well with other people. Specifically, difficult, irritating, incompetent, or actively malicious other people. This should not be surprising, given what we know of Marcus's actual daily circumstances. An emperor does not get to choose his colleagues the way a private citizen might. He inherits generals, senators, administrators, and family members of wildly varying competence and character, and he has to find a way to work with all of them, often for years at a stretch, regardless of how exhausting any individual relationship might be. Marcus's basic starting position on this subject is one that a modern reader might initially find strange, even troubling, until its actual function becomes clear. He argues repeatedly that when people behave badly, dishonestly, selfishly, cruelly, or simply stupidly, it is almost always the result of ignorance rather than deliberate malice. No one, he reasons, drawing on a very old idea traceable back through Stoicism to Socrates, knowingly and deliberately chooses what is genuinely bad for them. People who behave badly are, in Marcus's framework, mistaken about what is actually good, chasing wealth, status, or pleasure under the false belief that these things constitute the good life, when in fact, according to Stoic ethics, the only genuine good is virtuous character, and everything else is at best indifferent, neither good nor bad in itself. A person who lies to gain advantage, or who betrays a colleague for personal benefit, is not, on this reading, a monster acting with clear-eyed malevolence. They are a confused person, operating on a mistaken map of what is actually worth pursuing, doing damage the way a person with bad eyesight might stumble into others while trying, in their own clumsy way, to get somewhere. This reframing does real psychological work, and it is worth being precise about what that work is. It does not excuse bad behavior, and Marcus is not arguing that wrongdoers should face no consequences or correction. He was, after all, running a legal and administrative system that punished crime as a matter of ordinary governance. What the reframing changes is the emotional posture a person brings to encountering the bad behavior of others. Anger, in Marcus's analysis, typically rests on a hidden assumption of malicious intent, the belief that the other person knew better and chose wrong anyway, specifically to cause harm or express contempt. Strip away that assumption, replace it with the more accurate picture of a confused person operating on faulty premises about what is good, and the anger, while perhaps not eliminated entirely, tends to soften into something closer to patience, or even a kind of clear-eyed pity, which is a considerably more sustainable emotional state for a man who has to deal with difficult people every single day for years without a break. There is a specific passage, among the most practically useful in the entire notebook for anyone in a position of authority, in which Marcus works through a short list of reasons not to be angry at wrongdoers, almost like a lawyer building a case. Among the reasons he offers, that the wrongdoer is, in some sense, a relative of his, not literally, but in the broader Stoic sense that all rational beings share in the same universal reason, making enmity between them a kind of civil war within a single family. That the wrongdoer, being ignorant of the true good, is more to be pitied than resented, the way one pities rather than resents a person with impaired vision for walking into things. That the wrongdoer's action, once done, cannot be undone by Marcus's anger, and that anger applied after the fact accomplishes nothing except adding a second harm, damage to Marcus's own character, on top of whatever the original wrongdoing already caused. And that, ultimately, Marcus cannot know with certainty whether the other person's action was even genuinely voluntary in the fullest sense, given how thoroughly ignorance and faulty upbringing can distort a person's choices without their full awareness of it. None of this, it should be stressed clearly, amounts to naive permissiveness. Marcus governed an empire that maintained laws, courts, and real consequences for real crimes, and nothing in his private notebook argues against the existence or necessity of that system. What the passages address is something narrower, and, in its own way, more demanding. The internal emotional discipline required of the person doing the governing, judging, or simply living alongside difficult others, so that the necessary work of correction or justice can be carried out without being additionally poisoned by personal rage, resentment, or the corrosive, self-perpetuating cycle of contempt that anger tends to generate once it takes hold. There's a particularly striking passage on forgiveness worth pausing on, in which Marcus reminds himself that he too has done wrong, has been driven by the same confused pursuit of false goods that he now finds so irritating in others, and that he has, in the past, either restrained himself from completing a wrongful act or been prevented from it by circumstance rather than by pure virtue. Meaning the difference between himself and the wrongdoer in front of him may be considerably thinner, and considerably more a matter of luck and circumstance than his in-the-moment irritation would like to admit. This is a genuinely uncomfortable thing for a man in his position to write down, even privately, and it stands in sharp contrast to the kind of self-flattering moral superiority that absolute power so easily encourages in those who hold it. Marcus, by his own private account, seems to have understood that the emperor judging others' failures was himself a deeply flawed and ordinary man, distinguished from the people he judged less by inherent virtue than by training, circumstance, and continual effortful practice. The same practice, in fact, that fills the rest of the notebook we have been walking through tonight. There is a short passage near the end of Book 5, easily overlooked among the notebook's longer and more famous reflections, that has in recent decades become one of the most widely quoted lines attributed to Marcus, largely because the writer Ryan Holiday used a version of it as the title of a modern book on Stoic practice. Marcus writes that our actions may be impeded by obstacles, but that the impediment itself becomes an aid to action, and what stands in the way becomes the way forward. He offers a specific image to illustrate the idea. Fire, he says, takes whatever is thrown onto it and converts that fuel into flame and light, growing stronger from the very material that might, in a different context, have been expected to smother it. It is worth being precise about what this idea claims and does not claim, because in its modern popularized form, printed on posters, tattooed on forearms, repeated in business seminars, it sometimes gets flattened into a vague, feel-good assertion that obstacles are secretly good for you, or that everything happens for a hidden beneficial reason. That is not quite what Marcus is arguing, and the distinction matters. The claim, more precisely, is about the transformability of circumstance through the deliberate application of virtue, rather than about the intrinsic goodness of obstacles themselves. A genuine obstacle, illness, betrayal, defeat in battle, the death of a child, is not secretly a disguised blessing, and Marcus never pretends otherwise. His own notebook is full of unflinching acknowledgement of real loss and real difficulty. What the passage argues instead is that a well-trained mind can find, within almost any obstacle, some material for the exercise of a specific virtue, that the obstacle happens to call for patience in the face of delay, courage in the face of danger, fairness in the face of another's unfairness, endurance in the face of pain, and that this material is available precisely because the mind, unlike the fire, gets to choose what it does with what has been thrown onto it. The obstacle does not become good, but the response to the obstacle can be good, and that response is where the entire locus of human excellence in Marcus's framework actually resides. There is a useful analogy for this that Marcus gestures toward elsewhere in the notebook, comparing the human mind's relationship to external events to that of a skilled boxer facing an opponent, rather than that of a dancer following a partner's lead. A dancer needs cooperation to perform well. The routine depends on the partner moving in the expected way. A boxer needs no such cooperation. A good boxer adapts to whatever the opponent actually does, using the opponent's own movements, including hostile ones, as the raw material for the counter. Marcus is arguing that virtue functions like the boxer's skill rather than the dancer's. It does not require favorable circumstances to be exercised well. It requires only circumstances, favorable or not, because the raw material of virtuous action is simply whatever situation happens to be in front of a person at a given moment, and a sufficiently trained character can find the appropriate response to nearly any of it. Consider how directly this connects to what we've already covered. The dichotomy of control tells Marcus that the external event, the obstacle itself, is not up to him. The discipline of perception tells him how to examine and correct his immediate emotional reaction to it. This chapter's idea adds the final, active piece, that once the reaction has been examined and steadied, there remains a genuine, positive task available, not merely enduring the obstacle passively, but actively converting it into an occasion for some specific virtue that the situation happens to require. A blocked road becomes an occasion for patience and resourcefulness in finding another route. A dishonest colleague becomes an occasion for practicing fairness and self-control rather than matching dishonesty with dishonesty. A body weakened by illness becomes, in one of Marcus's own examples, an opportunity to demonstrate that a person's guiding reason can remain sound and unimpaired even while their physical circumstances are not. That the part of a person which actually does the choosing and judging is not, in fact, at the mercy of the part that gets sick or injured, provided the person in question has trained that distinction clearly enough to notice it under pressure. It's worth being honest, again, about the difficulty of what's being described here, rather than letting it slide into inspirational abstraction. Marcus was not writing this from a position of theoretical comfort. He wrote something very close to this idea while commanding a war he had not wanted, following the deaths of several of his own children, in the midst of a plague that had already killed a meaningful fraction of the empire he ruled. The obstacles he was converting into occasions for virtue were not hypothetical business setbacks or minor inconveniences of the kind. The idea sometimes gets applied to in its contemporary, commercialized form. They were, by any reasonable standard, genuine catastrophes. That he kept returning to this framework anyway, not as a one-time realization, but as a repeated, effortful practice, visible in the recurring structure of the notebook itself, suggests a technique he found necessary precisely because the material it was meant to work on was so severe, not despite that severity. There is a distinction worth drawing here between this Stoic idea and its close cousin, the Nietzschean concept of amor fati, or love of fate, which the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche would articulate many centuries later, and which is sometimes conflated with Marcus's position in popular writing today. Nietzsche's formulation pushes toward an almost aesthetic affirmation of one's entire fate, wishing for nothing to have happened differently, even in retrospect. Marcus's position, as expressed across the Meditations, is somewhat more restrained and arguably more usable in ordinary practice. Not necessarily a retrospective wish that the plague or the war had happened exactly as they did, but a forward-looking commitment to finding, within whatever has already happened and cannot now be changed, the specific material for a virtuous response in the present moment. It is a smaller, more disciplined claim than full cosmic affirmation, and for that reason it may be the more durable and repeatable one, available even to a person who cannot honestly claim to be grateful for their suffering, but who can still find, inside that suffering, something worth doing well. By the final years covered in the notebook, this entire framework, control, perception, mortality, duty, patience with others, the conversion of obstacles, had been tested about as thoroughly as any philosophy could be tested within a single human lifetime. What remained was the final application of all of it, Marcus's own death, and the uncomfortable question of what would become of everything he had built once he was no longer there to build it. Marcus Aurelius died in the year 180, most likely in March, at a military camp near Vindobona, the settlement that would, many centuries later, grow into the city of Vienna, or possibly at Sirmium, further along the frontier. The ancient sources are not entirely in agreement on the exact location, and a careful historian holds the discrepancy openly rather than resolving it with false confidence. He was 58 years old, and he had spent a significant portion of his final years, as he had spent much of the previous decade, commanding Roman forces against the Germanic tribes across the Danube, in a war that had never fully resolved into the lasting peace he seems to have hoped for. The ancient sources describing his final illness are fragmentary, and in places, contradictory, mixing plausible medical detail with the kind of dramatic embellishment common to ancient biography, a genre that valued a meaningful death scene over strict documentary accuracy. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that he fell ill, likely from a combination of factors related to age, the plague that had circulated through the empire for 2 decades by that point, and the physical toll of years spent campaigning in harsh frontier conditions at an age when most Roman men of his class would have long since retired to the comfort of their estates. Some later accounts describe him refusing food and drink in his final days, apparently aware that his condition was terminal and choosing to meet the end without unnecessary struggle. A detail that, whether precisely accurate in every particular, shaped somewhat by later writers eager to match his death to his philosophy, is at least consistent with everything the Meditations itself tells us about how he tried to think about the end of a life. The succession that followed his death has become, in the centuries since, one of the most frequently cited tragedies in the entire history of the Roman Empire, and it is worth addressing directly because it complicates any tidy narrative about philosophy guaranteeing good outcomes. Marcus was succeeded by his son, Commodus, whom he had elevated to co-emperor several years before his own death, breaking with the pattern of adoptive succession that had brought a string of notably capable rulers to power across the preceding century. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus himself, each having selected a successor based on demonstrated ability rather than blood relation. Commodus, by contrast, was Marcus's biological son, and his reign, which followed almost immediately after his father's death, is remembered by history as a marked departure from everything his father had modeled, marked by increasing brutality, a taste for public spectacle including personal appearances as a gladiator in the arena, and a style of rule that historians ancient and modern alike have generally judged harshly by comparison with his father's. This has led, understandably, to a somewhat uncomfortable question that historians and philosophers have wrestled with ever since. If Marcus's Stoic philosophy was genuinely capable of producing wisdom and good character, why did it apparently fail so completely to transmit itself to his own son, raised from birth in close proximity to the very father who modeled it so carefully in private? There is no fully satisfying answer available in the historical record, and it would be dishonest to manufacture one. Some historians point to the exceptional and unusual conditions of Commodus's upbringing. A young man who, unlike his father, was raised from early childhood, already knowing he would inherit absolute power. Without the extended apprenticeship and deliberate character formation that Antoninus Pius had provided Marcus across 2 decades before he ever took the throne himself. Others simply note that character formation, even under the most careful guidance, is not a guaranteed transmission from parent to child, and that Marcus's own notebook, read carefully, actually anticipates something like this problem. His repeated emphasis throughout the text on the limits of what one person can control regarding the choices and character of another, even a beloved child, reads differently, and perhaps more poignantly, once you know what became of Commodus after his father's death. It would be a mistake to let this outcome retroactively discredit everything that came before it, and it's worth being precise about why. The Meditations was never a book promising that Stoic philosophy guarantees good outcomes for a philosopher's descendants, or even good outcomes generally, in the sense of external success, or a tidy, well-resolved life story. It was, from its opening pages, a private record of one man's ongoing effort to govern his own character well, regardless of what happened around him, including, by the logic of the philosophy's own dichotomy of control, regardless of what became of his empire, his legacy, or even his own son after his death, none of which were ever, by Marcus's own framework, fully within his power to guarantee. Judged by the external, worldly standard of what became of Rome after he died, the story is genuinely difficult and, in important ways, disappointing. Judged by the internal standard Marcus set for himself throughout the notebook, did he, across the decades of war, plague, grief, and the daily grind of imperial administration, keep returning to the effort of acting with justice, patience, and clear judgment? The notebook itself remains the primary evidence, and it is difficult to read that evidence and conclude the effort was insincere or superficial. He was, by most historical accounts, mourned genuinely by the Senate and by much of the Roman public, an unusual outcome for an emperor whose reign had been defined more by hardship than by prosperity or conquest. He was deified after his death, following Roman custom for well-regarded emperors, and a column was erected in Rome depicting scenes from his Danube campaigns, a portion of which still stands today, one of the few physical monuments connecting the modern visitor directly to the wars that occupied so much of his final decade. But the monument that has outlasted the column and outlasted the empire itself was never intended as a monument at all, a private notebook, written for an audience of exactly one, that somehow survived the collapse of the very civilization it was written inside of, and reached, across nearly 2,000 years, an audience its author could never have imagined and, based on everything the book itself tells us about his relationship to fame and posthumous reputation, would likely have regarded with genuine surprise. We do not know exactly how the Meditations survived. This is worth stating plainly, because it is tempting, looking back from the present, to assume that a book this influential must have had an obvious, well-documented path from Marcus's tent on the Danube to the printed editions on shelves today. It did not. There is no record of Marcus arranging for the notebook's publication or preservation. There is no mention of it in the biography of Marcus written not long after his death, part of a collection of imperial biographies known as the Historia Augusta, a source historians treat with considerable caution given its well-documented tendency toward embellishment and unreliable detail. The notebook simply does not surface clearly in the historical record for centuries after Marcus's death, and when it does finally reappear in Byzantine sources from around the 10th century, it arrives already treated as a known, valued text, with no clear account of the intervening gap. This means that for roughly 800 years, the survival of one of history's most personally revealing philosophical documents depended on an unbroken, largely invisible chain of individual decisions, a scribe somewhere choosing to copy it rather than let the manuscript decay, a library somewhere choosing to preserve it through the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the political chaos that followed, a reader somewhere finding it worth the considerable expense and labor of transcription before the copy in front of them wore out entirely. Any single broken link in that chain, and we would have no notebook to read tonight. No different in that respect from the countless other ancient texts we know existed only because later writers mention or quote them. Texts that did not survive the same fragile, centuries-long chain of individual acts of preservation. There is something worth sitting within this fact, something that connects back to nearly everything we've covered across the previous chapters. Marcus wrote this book believing, by every indication in the text itself, that it would very likely die with him. A private exercise, not a bid for immortality, composed by a man who repeatedly and explicitly argued against organizing one's life around the hope of being remembered. And it survived anyway, not because he sought fame, but almost despite his apparent indifference to it, carried forward by generations of readers who found in his private struggle something recognizable in their own. This is, in the end, probably the closest thing to an explanation available for why this particular ancient text, out of the enormous number that did not survive, became one of the ones that did. It is not a systematic philosophical treatise offering a complete, airtight theory of ethics. There are internal tensions and unresolved questions throughout, moments where Marcus's Stoic cosmology sits somewhat uneasily alongside his evident personal grief, places where the same idea gets stated slightly differently across different books, in ways a stricter philosophical system would need to reconcile. What it offers instead, and what appears to have carried it across 18 centuries of readers, is something rarer and in some ways more valuable than systematic completeness. The visible, undisguised record of an intelligent, deeply burdened human being working, night after night, to become slightly better than his circumstances were making it easy for him to be. Every reader who has opened this notebook since, the philosopher, the soldier, the prisoner, the executive, the exhausted parent reading a few lines before falling asleep, has encountered essentially the same thing Marcus was doing for himself in that tent on the Danube. The ordinary, unglamorous, endlessly repeated work of trying to meet difficulty with something better than one's first automatic reaction to it. Not mastery achieved and then set aside, but practice, returned to again and again, because the need for it never fully goes away for anyone, emperor or otherwise. The lamp in that tent went out a very long time ago. The empire he ruled is gone. The war he fought against the tribes across the Danube is remembered today mostly by specialists and by a column in Rome that few visitors stop to examine closely. But the notebook, the private, unpolished, repetitive, quietly honest record of a man trying to live well under circumstances that gave him very little reason to expect he would manage it, remains open, on desks and in pockets and now on screens, still being read by people who, like Marcus, are simply trying to get through whatever the next difficult morning happens to bring. And